So, good afternoon, everyone. Now, today we're going to first talk about the League of Nations and the causes of World War II. And then, see, there are two small things, but they are important from examination point of view that we need to do. One is the rise of military fascism in Japan, and the other is the rise of fascism in Italy. Right? So that's also something we'll talk about. Now, what broadly that we are left with are a couple of topics. Okay. So let's firstly write down those topics so that we don't miss out on, because they're all small things which definitely must not be missed out on. So what we need to talk about is fascism in Italy as well as in Japan. That's something that we're going to talk about. We obviously have to talk about the Cold War and the Cold War era. Now, in the Cold War, we'll be talking about some general characteristics of Cold War, some general events related to the Cold War, but also some specific wars, because they can give you a direct question in the mains examination on some of them. So the Korean War is considered one of the most important ones that happened in 1950 to 53, or to 54 to be more precise. Then obviously the Vietnam War was one of the second major important wars in the Cold War era that started from 1946 and lasted up till 1975, almost for a 30-year duration. So that's also something that we're going to talk about. Another important one, which led to the whole issue of nuclear proliferation again coming to the forefront, was the Cuban Missile Crisis. That is something that is also important. Also, you see that the Cold War era was associated with the formation of the United Nations. After World War I, we saw the formation of the League of Nations. So we're going to write about League of Nations today. But also, after the Cold War, or after World War II is the formation of United Nations, they can ask you a question on United Nations, on UN reforms, something that you'll study in IR also, but also on the United Nations, why it was formed, what was its objectives, to what extent it did succeed in achieving those objectives. So even that is an important topic. Apart from that, one of the other things that you must also know about is something that we're going to talk about is the European Union. Or the European Union's formation was also an outgrowth of the Cold War era. And the major initial steps leading to the formation of European Union is something that we're also going to cover. Also, what is the formation of Israel? Israel was formed in 1948 and was partly related to World War I and World War II both. So that's also a topic that we're going to see, and that is the historical origin of the conflict. How is it related to World War I and II? Not around the current scenario, because it anyways is not that important from Indian foreign policy point of view. And whatever has to be covered will be covered in your international relations. A bit more detail of the current situation, etc. Or what is the changing position on Jerusalem, India's position, India-Israel relations, that's a separate topic. But the historical origins, how it's related to World War I and II. Also, what is the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, apart from these things, what we're also going to talk about is briefly decolonization in Asia and Africa. Okay, decolonization in Asia and Africa. And one of the things also that we need to also obviously talk about is communist revolution in China. This is also something that we have to talk about. So you see that there are a number of plenty of small things which are to be covered. Some of them are big topics also, but some of them are relatively smaller. And they can ask you direct questions on all of them. Okay. So, but this is not, I mean, one can always add more, but this is something that you must essentially do. Okay. So that is what we're going to do. Now today, firstly, let's write about the League of Nations, the causes of World War II. And either we'll start with fascism in Italy and Japan and the communist revolution in China, or we can start with the Cold War, that we'll see. Okay. So this is a rough list of topics that we are to cover in the next 2 or 3 lectures. Yeah. Is there any difference between fascism and totalitarianism? See, totalitarianism, fascism is something which was coined in a context. Okay, so it's a word which is being coined in the context of the fascist party which was formed in Italy, in the Milan di Fiasco. Okay, so from there the word fascist party came. So we today use the word to symbolize all authoritarian one-party regimes which tolerate no dissent, which favor extreme nationalism. So those are certain characteristics we associated with fascism. Now totalitarianism may be of a different kind also. Okay, so you can have a strong totalitarian state, but which does not talk of any aggressive nationalism. So you can have a dictatorship which is extremely totalitarian or authoritarian rule, but does not talk of aggressive nationalism or cultural superiority or anything. So yes, authoritarianism or totalitarianism is a part of fascism, but fascism is a bit more than that. That's that. Okay. Now, so let's firstly write about the League of Nations, and we've already discussed some of the points, some we'll discuss today. Now, the League of Nations now the League of Nations, as I told you, was formed in 1920, right? As the outgrowth of the Paris Peace Conference, the League of Nations was formed. And it was formed with 2 major objectives. One, the first objective was to form a collective security organization and to maintain peace and to prevent the outbreak of another European war. The second objective was also to promote human development. Okay, and promote social and economic progress. That was also the objective of the League of Nations. Now, to achieve these objectives, the League of Nations was supposed to be a collective security organization, which at its beginning, as I told you, had roughly 53 members. But it was essentially a British-French affair, because the US did not join the League of Nations, even though it was Woodrow Wilson's idea, and the Senate did not ratify the resolution to join the League of Nations. This was in keeping with the long-term US foreign policy of isolationism, or not intervening in European affairs, or not allowing a European interference in American affairs. So that's one of the characteristics, and also that is one of the reasons for the weakness of the League of Nations. Now, from your examination point of view, they can ask you a question that to what extent the League of Nations succeeded in achieving its aims. So we have to point out its positives and we have to point out its negatives as well. Now, we'll say that mostly that apart from certain arenas, in most of the other areas, the League of Nations failed to achieve its immediate or main objectives. But in certain arenas, it did achieve some of its objectives. So the answer has not to be only categorically saying that the League of Nations failed to prevent the outbreak of World War II, and so it was dissolved and it was a useless body. That is not the conclusion. The conclusion is that yes, the League of Nations did fail in achieving its core objective, that was to prevent the outbreak of another world war, but it did achieve a certain or it did take a number of positive steps in the direction of social progress in the immediate context of aftermath of World War I. And this was, for example, visible in a number of steps. So the negatives of League of Nations we have talked about yesterday also. We talked about how that the British and the French were essentially following a policy of appeasement, following which the League of Nations took no decisive actions against Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1935, or Italy's invasion of Ethiopia, or Germany's violation of the terms of Treaty of Versailles and its union with Austria in 1937-38. Right? So all of these steps we've talked about before. So while the League of Nations failed in preventing unilateral aggression by its member states towards other states, at the same time, and this was one of the core objectives of the League of Nations in which it failed to achieve it. But in other arenas, you see that there was a positive movement also. For example, the League of Nations was the one under whom the first major organization, that is the ILO, or the International Labour Organization, was set up. Now, ILO was set up under the League of Nations as an organ of the League of Nations immediately after World War I. Now, what is the ILO? The ILO, or the International Labour Organization, was set up to prescribe and to maintain adherence to minimum working standards to protect worker rights. In terms of work hours, in terms of wages or minimum wages, in terms of defined work hours or other welfare assurances that the workers needed. Now, why is the ILO being formed is also in the context of communism in Europe. Because the communists often talked about worker rights and the need to ensure worker empowerment. So to counter the communist propaganda, or to counter the communist assertion that it was interested in the welfare of the working class and not the capitalist Western economies also talked about ILO as an organization which would protect worker rights within the capitalist framework itself. So ILO was framed as a counter partly to the communist rise in Russia, and also as a counter to the rise of other communist parties across Western Europe. So ILO was an organization which prescribed minimum working hours, which prescribed minimum working wages, maximum working hours, and other health insurance and worker insurances that must be given to the workers by the states or industries which are a member of the ILO. So this was to improve the worker conditions in Western Europe, where communism was also on a rise. So ILO was an organization which was formed with this context, and it was relatively successful in improving worker safety, prescribing minimum wages, and fixing work hours for workers in Western Europe. It was a positive achievement. Another important work of the ILO, another important work of the League of Nations in the immediate aftermath of World War I was to ensure the repatriation of the prisoners of war refugees, and also to ensure that, for example, more than 90,000 German soldiers were stuck in France when the World War I came to an end. And at this point of time, to ensure the safe return of these soldiers who were prisoners of war, the League of Nations played an important role. So the League of Nations also played an important role in tackling of cholera and other problems which had broken out in Western Europe after World War I. So in terms of rehabilitation of people, in terms of rehabilitation of war refugees and prisoners of war also, the League of Nations played a positive role. Also, the League of Nations was the first organization under which a permanent international court of justice was established, which tried to resolve minor conflicts between member states by arbitration. And this is the precursor also when under the United Nations, later you see the formation of the International Court of Justice. Okay, so all these pre-UN frameworks were established by the League of Nations. And it would be, and in the conclusion, we'll also argue that it would be incorrect to say that the League of Nations was a complete failure. Though it failed to achieve its immediate objectives, it was the failures of the League of Nations and it was the developments that had been attempted with the League of Nations, which were to provide a building framework for the formation of United Nations later. For example, the League of Nations, one of the major reasons for the weakness of the League of Nations was that it had to make all its decisions by consensus. Okay, and if at all, there was, for example, in 1931, when Japan invaded Manchuria, the option before League of Nations was to pressurize Japan to withdraw from Manchuria. The League of Nations urged Japan to withdraw and criticized Japan's annexation of Manchuria. However, Japan did not withdraw. Now, at this point of time, League of Nations had two options: either to launch economic sanctions or go a step ahead and launch take military steps against the Japanese. Now, any military step which had to be taken with the consensus of all members. And arriving at consensus is an extremely complicated affair, which the League of Nations could not in most of the cases. So that was there. And the League of Nations even did not resort to economic sanctions, primarily because in 1929, the Great Depression had already started. These countries were already dealing with a economic crisis. And at that time, to impose an economic sanction on Japan would have hurt these economies as well. So, I mean, one of the things that you need to understand that even if Russia was facing sanctions after the Crimean annexation, it was not just hurting Russian economic interests, it was also hurting those economic interests who were buying the Russian oil at a cheap cost in Europe. So imposing economic sanctions does not hurt one way. It may hurt the country against which it is imposed more, but it hurts other countries as well. So, for example, I mean, when Iran was under the sanctions, India's imports from Iran decreased significantly, right? And as soon as Iran's out of sanctions, you see, apart from other reasons, that's also one of the reasons why the global oil prices declined a bit. It's not just the only reason, there's shale gas, there are other reasons as well. But that was also the reason. So imposing economic sanctions hurts the country on which it is imposed, but also on others who may be engaged in trade with them. So because of this, economic sanctions were not tried. Military sanctions could not be agreed upon, primarily because of lack of consensus. And any military action required a consensus. Also, the League of Nations did not have a dedicated military force of its own. In the sense that if the League of Nations was to take decisive military steps, it was to get the troops from the member states. So the member states were to contribute to troops on an ad hoc basis as and when required. It did not have a standing army of its own. So this was also a weakness of the League of Nations. So when you see the United Nations, some of these problems were sought to be addressed with the United Nations. That as compared to the League of Nations, which had 53 members, the United Nations today has more than 190 members, or near universal membership. Similarly, the United Nations has a more decisive method of decision taking, where you see that the consensus needs to be there in cases of any major action between the 5 permanent members majorly. And it is the veto power is enjoyed only by the 5 members. Whereas in the case of the League of Nations, anybody could veto a proposal. So that's there. The United Nations also has a peacekeeping force of its own, though the size of the peacekeeping force is not commensurate with the tasks of the United Nations, but nonetheless it does have a peacekeeping force of its own. The United Nations also has a Secretary General, which is an important figure in taking certain key decisive executive steps. So partly we say that some of the weaknesses of the League of Nations were learnt, or a lesson from the weakness of the structure of League of Nations was partly taken in while envisioning the United Nations after World War II. Okay, so this I'm telling you just as a part of the continuity framework so that you can see some similarities and some differences. There are other things also that we'll come to later. Okay, so that is something that you must know. Now what we're going to write firstly is the objectives of the League of Nations. Then what was the positives and the negatives of the working of the League of Nations, and then why did the League of Nations fail, which is also partly the failure of League of Nations is also the reason for the outbreak of World War II. Okay, so that's something that we're going to write down first. Now, and If you have any doubts, you can ask after once we've written. Okay. Now, the League of Nations was formed in 1920 after the Paris Peace Conference. The League of Nations was formed in 1920 after the Paris Peace Conference and lasted until 1946 when it was formally dissolved. The objectives of the League of Nations were A. To be a collective security organization which would deter any aggression against member states. And in case of breakout of conflict, would mount a collective response to neutralize the threat. B. The second objective was to prevent the outbreak of another European war. And C was to promote economic and social progress. Was to promote economic and social progress. Now, in terms of achieving these objectives, we say that firstly, on the negative side, the League failed to take any strict actions which could deter the fascist powers of Japan, Italy, or Germany from their aggressive expansionist agenda. For example, Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931 was only verbally challenged or was only verbally condemned by the League which did not impose any economic or military sanctions upon it. Japan's invasion of Manchuria in 1931. In protest of these verbal sanctions, or instead in protest of these verbal sanctions, Japan withdrew from the League of Nations in 1933. The second major example was Italy's invasion of Ethiopia or Abyssinia in 1935. Was challenged by the League of Nations only with a half-hearted imposition of economic sanctions on Italy, which did not include sanctions on oil, steel, iron, etc. So some of the, even though Italy's was actually imposed with mild sanctions after invasion of Ethiopia, these sanctions did not cover many critical aspects or many critical commodities that could have hurt Italy's interests significantly. And even these sanctions, part sanctions, were eventually withdrawn. And the result was that there was not any strict imposition of economic sanctions or military sanctions in case of Italy. So Italy's invasion of Ethiopia was challenged by League of Nations only with a half-hearted imposition of economic sanctions, which did not include sanctions on oil, steel, iron, etc. Even these sanctions were subsequently withdrawn. And see, the most glaring omissions on the part of League of Nations in upholding its mandate were visible when Germany resorted to Anschluss, or the forced union with Austria in 1938, and eventual takeover of Sudetenland Germany resorted Anschluss. Anschluss was a German word for the unification of Germany and Austria that we had talked about. Whether you call it forced unification or annexation, that the German term for it was Anschluss. So, and eventual taker of Sudetenland and Czechoslovakia in 1938. The League of Nations completely failed in checking Hitler's aggression in the above cases. Now, these were the negatives. In terms of the positive, we say that in the immediate aftermath of World War I, the League of Nations played a valuable role. The League of Nations played a valuable role in the post-war reconstruction and rehabilitation of Europe by a bringing about a safe return of war refugees, and prisoners of war across Europe. B. Played a positive role in containing the spread of the cholera epidemic that broke out post World War I. And C. ILO, or the International Labour Organization, was formed as an organ of the League of Nations with the aim of protecting worker rights and prescribing minimum working standards across Europe. The ILO played a positive role in ensuring minimum wages, fixed working hours, for workers, and thus played an important role in containing the spread of communism in Western Europe. ILO continues to function even today. So that's also a relatively important positive contribution. And the last, the Permanent Court of International Justice. The Permanent Court of International Justice was formed under the League of Nations and served to promote a rule-based international order by serving as a dispute resolution mechanism between member states. This was the predecessor of the ICJ, the International Court of Justice, established later under the United Nations. Established later under the United Nations. So these are the positives, these are the negatives. But we say that it was the failure of the League of Nations which was responsible for the outbreak of World War II, and thus the reasons for failure of the League of Nations. Now, in terms of the reasons for the failure of League of Nations, we firstly say, so in terms of reasons for the failure of League of Nations, we firstly say that the first reason was the weakness of its composition, or the weakness of its composition was reflected in the fact that the League of Nations, to begin with, was essentially, the League of Nations to begin with was essentially an Anglo-French affair, as the United States, USA, which was a key proponent of the League of Nations, did not join it. Woodrow Wilson's proposal of joining the League of Nations was not ratified by the US Senate, which continued sticking to a policy of isolationism, continued sticking to a policy of isolationism. In bracket, you can write the Monroe Doctrine, and we'll talk about it again today later. We'll expand on it. Okay. This was the policy of isolationism, that America would not tolerate any European interference in American affairs, and America would not interfere in European affairs. So that firstly is the weakness of its composition, and the League was essentially an Anglo-French affair, as US did not join it. Secondly, you see the Soviet Union was not allowed to join until 1934 due to the anti-communist mindset of the British and French. Thirdly, you see Japan resigned in 1933 and Italy in 1935. Germany joined the League of Nations only after 1926. Germany was allowed to join the League of Nations only after 1926, and it also withdrew in 1934. All of this was a reflection that the League of Nations actually, in terms of real membership, had only the British and the French at its core. This is one of the first reasons why the League of Nations is not taking many decisive steps, because the British and French were largely aversive to any war at this point of time, primarily because of their policy, and this was reflected in the policy of appeasement, which was adopted itself because of a number of reasons. So, firstly, you see that the League of Nations had a limited membership. That was the reason for its weakness. The second major reason, the first major reason for its weakness was the limited membership. The second major reason for its weakness. Has everybody written this much? Okay. The second major reason for its weakness was the League of Nations lacked the political will to enforce its mandate as the British and French adopted a policy of appeasement. The British and the French have adopted a policy of appeasement. The British and the French adopted a policy of appeasement in a policy of appeasement towards the aggressors. Now, what was this policy of appeasement? The policy of appeasement was adopted by the Western powers and this involved an intentional neglect of fascist transgressions in Europe, North Africa, and Asia. The reluctance to use financial or military sanctions against Germany, Italy, and Japan was due to A. The professed anti-communist orientation of Germany, Japan, and Italy. Germany and Japan had signed the Anti-Comintern Pact or Anti-Communist Pact in 1934. Britain and France saw the anti-communist nature of fascist parties as a hedge against spread of communism in Germany and Italy. So it was primarily, as we talked before, that they were adopting this appeasement policy partly because of the anti-communist nature of Germany, Italy, and Japan. And the second reason was also that they were already war averse, primarily because of the huge destruction and the huge setback that their economies also had faced as a result of both World War I and the Great Depression of 1929. So that was another major reason for the adoption of this policy of appeasement. The economic destruction and setback the economic destruction and setback suffered after World War I and the Great Depression of 1929, the economic destruction and setback suffered after World War I and the Great Depression of 1929 became another major reason which prevented Britain and France from engaging in any military action against Germany, Italy, and Japan, which could have further economic costs associated with it. The third reason for adopting a policy of appeasement, apart from the fact that they were anti-communist and that the economic destruction of World War I was yet that Britain and France were to recover from, was also the third important reason apart from these also was the rise of an anti-war sentiment across Western Europe, which the rise of an anti-war sentiment across Western Europe, which across Western Europe after World War I, which made any military intervention difficult to justify in front of domestic constituencies for Britain and France. And the last reason for this, because they can ask you a direct question like this also, that to what extent the policy of appeasement was responsible for the outbreak of World War II. So it's not just for League of Nations, but there's also a reason for the outbreak of World War II, so they can ask you a direct question on this also. Okay. And the last reason was there was a reflection within the Western powers that the Treaty of Versailles had imposed two strict conditions on Germany and a limited relaxation was in order. And a limited relaxation was in order. Thus, the Locarno Treaty of 1924-25, the the remilitarization of Rhineland by Germany in 1935 and its actions towards Austria in 1938 and Czechoslovakia were largely left unchecked. So all these were the reasons for the adoption of this policy of appeasement, and the adoption of this policy of appeasement actually emboldened Hitler's claims further, because Hitler realized that either the Western powers are not willing or do not have the moral or the mental strength to challenge his actions in the region. And that is one of the reasons why it actually became a reason for the outbreak of World War II, because it encouraged Hitler to go ahead with even more and more steps and expecting that the British and the French would either not take any major action or would try to enter into a peaceful negotiation at max. So that is also the reason which becomes the reason for the outbreak of World War II. So now when we write, so thus the conclusion that we can write for the League of Nations is the League of Nations failed in upholding its core mandate, that of preventing the outbreak of another world war. However, despite its failures, the League, represented a bold attempt at establishing a transnational organization, or an organization cutting across nations, or involving many a number of nations together. A transnational organization meant to uphold international peace. Also, the notable steps taken by ILO and the post-war rehabilitation work across Western Europe. And the post-war rehabilitation work across Western Europe meant that in the social arena, the League of Nations registered significant success. Now, and in the social arena or in the socio-developmental arena, that you can write it that way also, that in the socio-developmental upholding worker rights, rehabilitation, etc. In the socio-developmental arena, the League of Nations registered significant success. Now, in the causes for the failure of League of Nations, while we are writing, we wrote about the policy of appeasement and its limited membership. Here, we are writing in the conclusion one more para, which also is actually the weakness only of the League of Nations. And that is the, and lastly you can write in this, moreover, the weakness of League of Nations, and these are the other weaknesses of League of Nations. Moreover, the weakness of League of Nations visible in its failure to arrive at consensus. Moreover, the weakness of League of Nations visible in its failure to arrive at consensus over the mode of action against aggressor states resulted in the United Nations resulted in the United Nations the successor of League of Nations, resulted in the United Nations, that is the successor of League of Nations, restricting the veto powers only to the 5 permanent members. So that's also actually a weakness. You can see this as a third point also of the weakness of the League of Nations. And as the reason for the weakness of the League of Nations. And one more thing that you can write in the weakness is the absence of a dedicated military force at the disposal of League of Nations to launch a quick, decisive military intervention. The League of Nations often had to depend upon contribution of troops from member states, which greatly slowed down any military intervention. So all of these were the reasons for the failure of the League of Nations and also the conclusion. Now we'll write down the causes of World War II in a minute. But in terms of causes of World War II, we say that it was the policy of appeasement that the Western powers adopted. So on the one side, the Western power did nothing to check the aggressive aims of Italy, Japan, and Germany. On the other side, it was Germany's expansionist agenda, whether it was the policy of Lebensraum or the policy of seeking expansion or seeking more territorial expansion to settle German people, and that Lebensraum was the idea of living space for Germany or for Germans, and to unite all German-speaking areas together. That was also one of the aims. So all of this was fueling Germany's aggression. That was one of the problems. The other problem was also the fact that the Western powers were adopting this policy of appeasement. Another major problem was the role of the propaganda machinery. And again, herein comes the role of press, where you see that the press did not play any major positive role in upholding, in preparing a fertile ground for any peaceful negotiations. Rather, what you see is that within, for example, in the Soviet Union or within Germany, there was a use of the press to push forward the cultural superiority agenda. For example, in Mussolini and Hitler's case, they used the press actively to propagate the idea or the myth of their cultural or racial superiority. And at the same point of time, they talked about how the others were inferior to them, and there was a need to reassert their authority and also undo and take revenge for the Treaty of Versailles, or for the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles. So these are all the causes that we're going to talk about. But what happened in World War II that we've already discussed. Now let's firstly talk about the consequences of World War II. Now in terms of consequences of World War II, they can give you a direct question also, that how did World War II affect, or what was the influence of World War II on the international order? Discuss the impact of World War II on the global order from in the post-1945 period. Discuss. So this kind of a question they can also give you. And to answer such a question, what you see that when you look across Europe, the whole World War II had a profound influence on Europe, not just from the 1945 to 1990 period, but its effect is visible even today. In the sense that, for example, after World War II, you see that one of the first organizations which was formed after World War II is the United Nations. And the United Nations is the umbrella organization under which you see a number of other organizations that are functional at the international level. You see their formation. So whether it's a World Bank, the World Bank was initially the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Whose reconstruction and development? The Western Europe, the war-damaged Western Europe. So the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development was established after this. The IMF, or the International Monetary Fund, was established after this. Or for example, you look at the WHO, the World Health Organization was established as an office of the United Nations immediately after World War II, and this was to look at the whole question of the World Health Organization, though its name. And today the World Health Organization, one of the major focus is on the developing world, but immediately after post-World War II, its focus was on tackling the health related problems that had cropped up in Europe because of the destruction of World War II. So you see firstly a number of political organizations or international organizations that we see today were formed immediately after World War II. The second major impact of World War II was visible in the arena of the nuclear arms, or the beginning of the nuclear arms race, when 1945 United States develops its own nuclear weapons, soon quickly followed by the Soviet Union in 1949. Then later Britain and France also, and later in 1962-63 is, by 63 is China also moving towards nuclear weapons. So the coming of the nuclear age was also directly a consequence of World War II. So that's also another major consequence of World War II. Another major consequence of World War II, as we all know, is the beginning of the Cold War. And the origins, and they can ask you a question like this also, that the origins of the Cold War could be traced in the differences between the European powers over World War II. Discuss. Now, if you remember that yesterday we had written about that how the beginning of Cold War was rooted in many developments from 1920s to 1940s also. For example, the ideological divide between the Western capitalist economies and the communist Soviet Union. That was the ideological divide in the sense of what is a better mode of economic planning. Whether individual ownership of industries and no interference of the state in the economic activities, or a state-led model of economic planning where the state was the key owner of industries. So this was an ideological divide which was already there from 1920s to 1940s. And another major event that happened during World War II was the delay in opening of the, or reopening the Western Front, even as Soviet Union suffered the brunt of German aggression. And this is why you see that Stalin said that Britain and France were not honest in their involvement in World War II. And this was also one of the major reasons why the Soviet Union was convinced that even though Germany was to be neutralized, this would not mean an end of differences between the West and the Soviet Union. So even that was a reason for the outbreak of the Cold War. And this is called as the Cold War primarily because it did not involve a direct military conflict between the Western powers and Soviet Union. The Cold War era was often between either the Western powers and one or the other state supported by the Soviet Union, or between any state supported by the Western powers and the Soviet Union. So one could say that these were indirect wars. Some could say that these were proxy wars also, but one could say that these were indirect military conflicts between the Western powers and the Soviet Union. There was no direct military confrontation in which the Western powers and the Soviet Union were engaged in a direct military combat, but they were often supporting or opposing pro-communist or anti-communist regimes in one or the other region. Most often what you'll see across the Cold War was a reflection of another major thing. And this is also a major consequence of World War II. That post and we'll write all of this, so don't worry. That post-World War II, what is happening? Post-World War II, what is happening is the question, or some of the questions that happened like after World War I were visible after World War II also. One of the first thing was that World War II resulted in a huge destruction in Europe, and post-war reconstruction was an urgent need. And if post-war reconstruction had to happen, somebody had to foot the bill. Now, the Western European economies had already been destructed because of the war, and they were not in a position to bear the full economic cost of this reconstruction. And if US was to avoid a repeat of what happened after World War I, was that almost a couple of years after World War I, there was a contraction of the European market, right? So after, and and it was World War II which had played a very important role in finally bringing the Great Depression in United States to an end, because World War II again meant the destruction of Europe. And because the European industries were not producing goods, European countries were depending upon the US imports again. So one of the things what you also see is that US exports had again rapidly picked up during the World War II period to the Western countries. The Western countries had depended upon the Lend-Lease agreements. The Lend-Lease agreements were the agreements where the Western countries had no money to buy goods. So the Western European countries were given loans by the United States to buy US goods. And now post-World War II, if there was not a continuation of some form of economic assistance or a complete calling off of economic assistance to Western European countries by the United States, the Western European economies would collapse. And that is why you see the US resorted to a plan of economic aid, and that was the Marshall Plan. And the Marshall Plan was something that we're going to talk about. But the Marshall Plan, because see, they've given you 10 markers and 15 markers already. From the Cold War era, they can also give you 5 markers also in your mains examination. So they can give you a 5 marker on Marshall Plan, they can give you another 5 marker on some other plans that we're going to talk about. Okay, or on the Truman Doctrine or some of the other things that we're going to talk about. So the Marshall Plan was $13 billion of economic aid then in 1947, which was given by the United States to the Western European countries. Now this was nominally open to all countries of Europe, but were in reality used only by the Western European countries because the Soviet Union was not willing to allow such form of economic assistance to come to more communist countries in Eastern Europe. For them, the Soviet Union started another plan, and that was the Molotov Plan. The whole economic assistance, that's what you need to know. The economic assistance in the form of Marshall Plan was meant to serve many purposes. $13 billion was not enough to do the whole reconstruction of Western Europe, but was an important sum of amount. If you compare it to that was $13 billion then. If you compare it to today, that would be roughly around 130 billion US dollars of assistance in today price terms. So it was a good amount of assistance, but still was not enough. But it was valuable primarily because it would firstly prevent a complete collapse of the Western European economies. Secondly, it would allow them to buy American goods and would ensure that American markets do not suddenly collapse and American goods continue to find a market in Europe. Also, it would prevent the spread of communism in Western Europe, because I told you that the period while the Western Europe was dealing with the Great Depression, the Soviet Union and the communists were economically expanding or economically flourishing. So the communist model, to prevent the spread of communists and communism primarily in Western Europe, also the Marshall Plan was a very valuable tool. So because of all these objectives, the Marshall Plan was considered a very key element of US economic assistance that was extended to Western Europe, but was meant to serve its own geopolitical purposes and to prevent the spread of communism in Europe. Okay. So that's also one of the major consequences of World War II. And also, finally, one of the major consequences of World War II was also a very strong rise in public sentiment against involvement in any further war on whatever grounds, for whatever reasons. That is why World War II had also resulted in a great destruction of the Western European economies, which had even weakened their military might. And this is one of the reasons that we discussed, that post-World War II, Britain and France had become militarily and economically weak. The public sentiment in these countries was averse to any further involvement of their troops in any war. And this is one of the reasons why Britain and France refused from looking into a military option, primarily for holding on to their colonies across Asia or Africa region. That is why I told you that 1945 to 1960, in a span of 15 years, more than 50 countries which were earlier colonies attained independence, because war had a negative impact on the economic and military capabilities of Western European countries which had a number of colonies. All of these are impacts of World War II. Okay, so these are all impacts that we must know about, and then we'll talk about the Cold War era later. Okay, so now any doubts still here? Firstly, yeah.
Sir, why International Court of Justice is established in Netherlands, Hague only? Why not in India?
Why not in? Why would it be established? So why is it, okay, almost all these, once the United Nations was established in Stockholm and Geneva, you see that most of the other organs are also established there itself. And anyways, why would it be established in India? India was not one of the India was one of the founding members of the United Nations, but was not one of the 5 permanent members. And the United Nations was also predominantly a Eurocentric body to begin with. So it was centered across Europe. So that's why its organs are also going to be established there. So the US, so it could have been established in US also, but one of the things is that US and European countries going into the United Nations had an agreement or a sort of an informal agreement that when it came to the IMF, which was also one of the key organizations, that would be predominantly European, whereas the World Bank and some other organizations would be predominantly headed by Americans. So that was their informal agreement. It's not formal agreement, but informally, from 1940s onwards to 2010, or in fact to 2015, all the IMF ones have been from Europe. All the World Bank ones, except for the current one, were the Americans. So that was their informal thing. Anything else?
The positivity of a League of Nations, we can say that it has been successful to bring about peace for a brief period of time. Because since 1990 to 1930.
See, what he's asking is, can we say that the League of Nations did achieve its aim of maintaining peace for a brief period of time from 1919 to 1934 or 1939? See, it would be incorrect to argue that, primarily because it's not that even any, it's not that it is failing only in 1939. It's failing from much before that itself. So, I mean, in the fact that even since the beginning of 1930, its failures were visible, which is only resulting in 1939 in World War II. It means that even for a decade or two, you see that's not there. In contrast to League of Nations, if you compare it with the Congress of Vienna, it was relatively more successful. Right? Though the Congress of Vienna was not a collective security organization per se, but it did, if you talk about peace or maintenance of peace in Europe, it was relatively more successful in laying the foundations for maintenance of peace in Europe than, the League of Nations. So that's there. Anything else? Yeah.
Was there any mandate or anything that will consider that what work exactly League of Nations will do?
Was there a mandate? So, apart from this, the League of Nations, these had other, so what we've written, that's there. Apart from that, the League of Nations was also had also a mandates commission. Now, this mandates commission was to take care of or supervise those areas which had been freed from Germany in many cases or had been granted as a protectorate. For example, in 1924, this I did not tell you, but in 1924, once the Saar region is taken away from Germany by France because Germany was unable to pay the reparations. So Germany was unable to pay the reparations of the League of Nations, of the Treaty of Versailles, because of which the Saar region, the mineral-rich region, was being taken away from Germany. But this was to be given to France only for a period of 1 decade. And to monitor, to ensure that France does not gobble up the Saar region was to be a protectorate, and the League of Nations was to monitor its working. Okay, and also after the decade, the Saar region was to undergo a plebiscite, and after the plebiscite, it was to be decided whether Saar would remain with France or would go back to Germany. So even this was monitored by the League of Nations, and Saar region was returned to Germany in 1934. That's also there. But we did not write it because unnecessarily, I mean, there are many events. We can only write a few number of events which are enough to write an answer.
I wanted to just ask that, is there any particular minute that these are 3 or 4 areas in which League of Nations will work?
Okay, so as I told you that, are there any particular areas that the League of Nations chose at its areas of work? The core activity of the League of Nations was this only. This was the core, the most important function was this only. That its core function was to prevent any aggression against its members. And if at all there was an aggression against its members, then all the members were to unite and act collectively in the form of either as a group, whether in the form of economic sanctions, by imposing economic sanctions or military sanctions or whatever. So that was their core mandate. The social mandates were also, for example, when you talked about the ILO or some others, these were the core aspects, that all that they took as a mandates on themselves. For example, there is no discussion in the League of Nations about human rights. But when you see United Nations is formed, the United Nations talks about upholding the rights not just of nations, but also of the citizens within these nations, or also the idea of human rights. Something that we'll talk about later.
And also for keeping peace across the world.
So that's something that the United Nations talks about in a more broad manner. Here, it's predominantly to prevent the outbreak of another war. United Nations says that its function is to promote international peace. So it's a more radical aim, one could say. देखिए, to prevent the outbreak of war is a limited aim. That we don't want another war, or we don't want actually the breakout of another major war. But if I say the aim is to protect world, or the aim is to promote world peace, then that is not to just prevent outbreak of hostilities, but create conditions suitable enough that promotes peace. Okay, so that's a more wider agenda. देखिए, war क्या है और peace क्या है? So that's something that is also a philosophy, and that's something that you will probably read about in ethics also. Or okay, have your ethics is done? You've talked about ethics in international relations also, just war and all of these things, right? So when you see that, again, promotion of international peace is not just ensuring that war does not break out, but creating the material, the social and the economic conditions that prevent the outbreak of hostilities. Okay, so for example, one of the reasons which also often provokes the outbreak of war is economic weakness and economic deprivation, or ethnic conflicts. So dealing with all of that is seen as a mandate of the United Nations. The League of Nations did not have any of them. It is only to prevent the outbreak of hostilities between countries.
But both are interrelated with each other.
One is a more broader objective, that's it. Yeah, so one is a more broader objective, that's it. So anything else? Now let's quickly write down. देखिए, आज तो लिखना है. So let's quickly write down about, firstly, the causes of World War II. Now, there's not much to write here because we've already written everything before, indirectly. We're just writing the points here. Okay. Now, in terms of causes of World War II, firstly, we see the aggressive, expansionist aims of the Axis powers, the aggressive expansionist aims of the Axis powers, motivated by ideas of cultural and racial superiority, provoked, motivated by the ideas of cultural and social and racial superiority, provoked immediate aggressions across Europe and Asia and North Africa. Right? This is something that we've already written, so we don't need to expand on this any further. We've already written, right, that how Italy is taking on Ethiopia or other players are taking on other regions. So that's also motivated by this idea that Italy was culturally superior, or the Italians were culturally superior to other in Europe. Or why were the Italians superior? Because it was Rome, which was the center of Europe, ancient Europe, and the Holy Roman Empire, which was the center of Europe, or in the ancient period, was where Christianity had begun, and this is why they are the culturally superior powers. Similarly, Germany talks about the whole idea of Aryan being the descendants of the Aryans, and that is their racial superiority. In Asia, the Japanese also talked about that they were the superior Asian race that was meant to rule Asia. So all of this provoked aggressive expansions. Secondly, the failure of Britain and France to deter the fascist powers also emboldened the Germans, Italians, and Japanese, who were convinced is that USA continued with the policy of isolationism and took no actions to check the expansion of Axis powers. And fourth is the use of aggressive nationalist propaganda the use of aggressive nationalist propaganda to or the use of aggressive nationalist propaganda by Hitler and Mussolini to rally domestic support for their expansionist agenda meant that there was little. It just reminded me of a joke. So that there was little. We'll write this point first. So use of aggressive nationalist propaganda by Hitler and Mussolini to rally domestic support for their expansionist agenda meant that there was little domestic, there was little questioning within these countries of their foreign policy. And the last point, as we've already written before, was to avenge or undo the humiliation imposed by Treaty of avenge or undo the humiliation imposed by the Treaty of Versailles. Now, so basically, you'll get a break also. I can sense that you're almost halfway did writing all the way. So there's something. देखिए आपका जो ये क्वेश्चन पूछा भी गया है बार-बार जो आपके मेंस में that was asked last year also. The question that was asked last year also, I think last year in your mains examination on Amartya Sen's views on growth and development. You would have studied that already in economics also. And one of the classics to, okay. So even if you've not studied, you can read it on your own. The sab kuch, I'm just saying. So even if you've not studied, but you can watch this video and this brings it squarely in the light. It's a 6-minute video, but it's something. Just a sec. I just saw it.
Let them celebrate.
What was the date? Yes, this is the one. No. This is not just a matter of joke. Why I'm saying so is because this is where the Amartya Sen thing that was asked in the examination before also, and it's been written a number of times before also, was asked indirectly that discuss Amartya Sen's viewpoint on poverty and development, right? So,
56.
yes, the volume. Oh, okay.
It was pitched as nothing short of miraculous, the Gujarat model. And it was the promise of emulating the model at the national level that was key in catapulting Narendra Modi from Gujarat to the centre. Now, the much doubted Gujarat story has been seen, as per your confirmation bias, as either Modinomics, a term specially coined to define Narendra Modi's vision for growth, or as spin doctoring via clever cherry picking of data. The Reserve Bank of India's latest handbook on statistics on Indian states presents a more sobering picture. Gujarat occupies a top 5 ranking on parameters such as net state domestic product, growth rate of net state domestic product, net state domestic product per capita. It ranks 3 in the availability of power per capita behind Haryana and Punjab. But the state's rankings see a sharp drop on social development indicators like infant mortality, poverty, sex ratio. The Raghuram Rajan Committee on the Backwardness of States, determined on a composite performance index that gives equal weight to education, health, etc., places Gujarat 14th among 28 states. Even on physical infrastructure, where Gujarat has ranked high on state highways, its ranking on smaller roads network has slipped, with states like Maharashtra, West Bengal going past Gujarat.
You can think of a school which focuses on its toppers. So therefore it wants to have, say, good, computer facilities, good sort of gym facilities, but all focused on the stars. So therefore infrastructure measures will look good. Regulatory measures will look good because you're all focused on creating a couple of winners who will do well. But when you start looking at averages, when you start looking at sort of the performance across the whole sort of, range of, that's where the sort of, more gray areas start, popping up. But otherwise, I think this is part of the overall Gujarat model that you want. It's a bit like the Thatcher model of the economy, where, and you know, there are serious intellectual supporters of it, so it's not to be dismissed, because after all, we have also seen models that do not deliver either growth or, you know, equality. So we have also seen the kind of more centrally planned type models and the sclerosis that some mixed economy, even on our, you know, the height of the Garibi Hatao days, there's nothing much to be that nostalgic about that model too.
So the question, as asked since the Sen versus Bhagwati debate or the inclusive development versus growth model debate, are both sides cherry-picking data?
One of the reports that we highlighted the basic contradiction of the Gujarat model, and it's really not a matter of opinion because it's all over in the official statistics, is high growth rates, high per capita income, but below average measures of social indicators, and really below average measures of poverty and so on. So this is a genuine tension. This is no left versus right, BJP versus anti-BJP issue.
Let's look at the poverty numbers. Gujarat's rank, which determines how successful it has been in lifting people out of poverty, has actually declined over the years. Its position among states steadily fell, and in 2011, the latest year for which information is available, the state ranked a dismal 10th. In comparison, Kerala improved its rank on this index from number 6 to number 1 over the same period. Remember Malayalis being upset with Prime Minister Modi's election rally remarks comparing Kerala to Somalia, resulting in the hashtag #PoMoneModi. Well, Kerala incidentally has consistently performed well on social development indices.
What did Gujarat look like in the early 90s when liberalization was happening? And in separate work, I've shown that at that time, Gujarat's growth rate did outstrip that rest of India. So, as opposed to during Modi's time, as was claimed, where for which there's no evidence that Gujarat's growth rate outstripped India, which is an issue as to whether Modi did something miraculous to the Gujarat's growth process, for which the evidence doesn't seem to support it. But in the early 90s, right after liberalization, when India's growth had taken off, Gujarat's growth had differentially taken off. So that's also true, right? So that if there's a trend break, to use economics jargon, the trend break happened in the early 90s. So I actually looked at poverty numbers in the early 90s and whatever comparable figures are available. The striking bit is it's like you expect some changes because after all the growth is real. I don't think there is any doubt that in whichever measures and methods we use to calculate growth and state incomes, Gujarat is a leader. The cautious statement to make here is that 25 years of growth has not lifted many out of poverty. That's true. So growth has not led to trickle down.
If so, why did the people of Gujarat return the BJP to power consistently over the last 2 decades?
If politics was only driven by economic fundamentals, and if economic fundamentals meant essentially the collective well-being of the majority of the population, then clearly this is not the outcome we should be seeing. I grew up in West Bengal, in the 70s and 80s, and the Left Front government was in power from 1977 to 2011. And in the early years of the Jyoti Basu government, there were actually very good reforms carried out in the rural area. I think it's now agreed upon across the whatever political or other divide. But the reality is that the Jyoti Babu was the longest serving chief minister of India. Modi comes second. And I don't think, maybe I can't speak for his most staunch defenders, but I would say even his moderate defenders cannot say that West Bengal's growth model has been tremendous under the Left Front regime.
Interestingly, the term Gujarat model finds little mention in the ongoing election campaign.
The irony of that is so thick that we can almost choke on it. I guess it's thicker than the Delhi air right now that's creating problems during the contest. So the irony is very thick here. But it also shows what I truly admire about BJP's political strategy, the pragmatic ruthlessness it can show.
That would be very unacceptable for many to see in the class. So I don't want to go there. But the economics is what we're more interested in. So, why this is something that's the whole growth versus development debate, the Sen versus the Bhagwati debate, the growth and capability, all of that. And why, even though they're taking the example of Kerala, a better example even is that of Himachal Pradesh. And if you see the Gujarat and Himachal Pradesh comparison, see, Kerala was always historically a better developed state. Okay, just like Gujarat. Gujarat was also economically always a very prosperous state, and Kerala was always human development indices wise a good state. So this kind of comparison also, though is okay, but probably is a comparison between two which almost were at the same level 20, 30 years ago. But a bigger example is Himachal Pradesh, because Himachal Pradesh reflection in all these indices has been much better than any other state in terms of picking up growth in the past 20 years in terms of Human Development Index. In terms of HDI, the growth of Himachal Pradesh has been much better than any other Indian state. Okay? And that's when you compare that with Gujarat, whether in terms of per capita income also it's equal to Gujarat, and in terms of HDI, it's much ahead of Gujarat. So when you look at interstate disparity within India, whether in growth or in development data, or in the HDI data, one of the things that has to be seen is that even, so, you know, one, देखिए, ऐसी बहुत सारी debate थी. One was the debate of whether there must be growth, one must pursue growth or not. That question was settled in the fact that if you don't have growth, equitable distribution of growth is a no-starter, right? So yes, economic growth is essential. But even if you have economic growth, that itself is not sufficient to bring about development. And that's the growth versus development debate. That economic growth does not necessarily translate into human development. Because if that was the case, then Gujarat is a good example of it, which has a very high per capita income for a long period of time, but in terms of HDI, it is lagging behind many other states. And that is primarily because unless the state's policy are also actively looking at how to bring about human development, then that is not possible. For example, why I was giving you the Himachal example. Himachal was one of the first countries, one of the first states in northern India to universalize primary education much before the right to education came. Okay, that is one of the reasons why Himachal's literacy rates were much better. Okay, similarly, Himachal also was a state which is again a hilly state where economic development is relatively difficult. But still, Himachal has relied upon agriculture, at the same point of time has relied upon ecotourism and household tourism also as a way of promoting economic growth. And apart from literacy, the next major thing that Himachal also focused upon very strongly was healthcare. So in terms of universalization of primary, or in terms of moving or increasing coverage of primary healthcare, as well as universalizing primary education, Himachal started much before many other Indian states started. You can go and Google this and read about this some more, you know, Himachal, etc. And because that is when you say that how do you ensure that there is more equitable development in the country, is not by saying that there must be or must not be capitalism. That debate is long settled. The whole question is not whether there must be individual ownership of industries or not. That must be there. But the state also needs to actively look at certain sectors which can have a positive multiplier effect. So that is why the Human Development Index, whether it's life expectancy, whether it is schooling or literacy, or there is per capita, right? So even in HDI, where per capita has a very important value, ऐसा नहीं है कि HDI calculation में per capita does not have a value, income. That also has an income, and Himachal is a very, very good example of that, you know, comparison, something that you can look at. And that is the whole growth versus development debate. That development is when you empower individuals and empower individuals to realize their own capabilities. That is what is the Amartya Sen's model of capability approach. That the aim of government policy must be to build the capabilities of individuals, whether it is their employability, whether it is their literacy, whether it is their health. Access to health, education and employability or skills is what is going to build the capability of individuals, which will actually ensure a more equitable development. तब मेरे पास ज़्यादा टाइम नहीं है इसमें जाने का, लेकिन आप ज़रूर इसके बारे में you should read, because it's been asked before also, and it is something that you can use in essays also. Okay, so that's there. Now let's come back to where we are supposed to be. And that is, what is the impact of World War II? Now, the impact of World War II was primarily, in terms of the impact of World War II, firstly, what we're going to write out is, so another way of writing about the impacts is, again, we can write it in terms of political impacts, economic impacts, and other social impacts. Okay. So in terms of political impacts, firstly, the ideological divide between the Western Bloc and the Soviet Union, visible during the 1920s to 1940s, was exacerbated. The ideological divide between the Western Bloc and the Soviet Union, visible during the 1920s to 1940s, was exacerbated by the delay in, by the delay, or by the intentional delay, by the intentional delay on behalf of Western powers in reopening the Western Front against Germany, even while Stalin repeatedly requested, even when Stalin repeatedly requested for it. This later resulted in Stalin arguing that an iron curtain had descended. This later resulted in Stalin arguing that an iron curtain had descended across Western Europe. The Iron Curtain, or the talk of an Iron Curtain, was that the divide between the West and the communists was not bridgeable. That this was a divide which had been fossilized by the difference, or which had been hardened by the differences over the way of tackling the Germany in World War II. So this is where, and thus one could notice the beginning of the Cold War era. And thus one could notice the beginning of the Cold War era. The second major political impact was the destruction of the European economies meant that the bipolar era had begun. The bipolar era, in the sense that there were only two major powers left in the world now. One was the United States and the other was the Soviet Union. Meant that the bipolar era had begun as the Western, as the bipolar era had begun as the American supremacy was established in the Western Bloc, whereas the Soviet Union was the professed leader of the Communist bloc. The third important political impact was the formation of the European Union, the formation of the United Nations. The formation of the United Nations. The UN, or the movement towards formation of United Nations began at the Yalta and Potsdam conference. Yalta and Potsdam conferences in 1945. The movement towards formation of United Nations began at the Yalta and Potsdam conferences in 1945 and began towards formation of UN at Yalta and Potsdam conferences in 1945, which was formed to prevent the outbreak of another world war, an aim that its predecessor, the United Nations, the League of Nations, had failed to achieve. Fourth, also was the beginning of the nuclear arms race. The beginning of the nuclear arms race, as US used the nuclear weapons in 1945, it speeded the efforts in Soviet Union to achieve nuclear parity which saw the Soviet Union acquiring nuclear weapons by 1949. So this was the beginning of the nuclear age. So these are the political consequences that we must write about. Now, apart from this, in terms of the economic consequences, in terms of the economic consequences, firstly, we say the introduction of the Marshall Plan by USA and the Molotov Plan by the Soviet Union in 1947 were economic aid programs started by the respective camps to bring about a reconstruction of the war-ravaged European economies. Now, because they can give you a direct question on the Marshall Plan also. The Marshall Plan was a $13 billion aid and soft loan extended to Western European countries by United States. Its aim were A, geopolitical. To prevent the rise of a communist sentiment in Western Europe, which dealt with destruction, unemployment, and high prices. B, and the Marshall Plan was also extended to West Germany. Okay. Now, if you remember yesterday, we talked about that how you see that from the West, the British, the French, and the US forces marched into Germany, and from the East, you see the Soviet forces marched into Germany. Now, contrast this also with the fact that when Germany was defeated in World War I, the aim was to impose penalties on Germany. But here, the aim is to bring about reconstruction of Western European countries, including West Germany, to prevent, firstly, any revengeful situation again from building in, to prevent any fascist regimes from rising, and to prevent the communists also from gaining ground in Western Germany. That's also the objectives behind the whole Marshall Plan. So, one was to achieve the geopolitical aim. The second was to continue to ensure the continuation of maintenance of European market for American goods and industries. To ensure the continuation of maintenance of the European markets for American goods and industries, because this aid was meant to be used either for funding infrastructure projects or for buying goods from American industries. And even while in these infrastructure projects were being constructed, say new roads, highways, etc., or new buildings, etc., even the contracts for many of these projects were given primarily to American-owned companies. Okay, so that was also there. So to ensure the continuation of maintenance of European markets for American goods and industries. These were the aims of the Marshall Plan. To achieve these aims, the economic aid was to be used or was to be utilized. To achieve these aims, the economic aid was to be utilized to achieve these aims, the economic aid was to be utilized to bring about speedy reconstruction of infrastructure projects in Western Europe and for buying American goods. So this was the Marshall Plan. So that's the major economic thing that you have to talk about. Now, in terms of the social arena, would we say that in terms of the social impact, so we talked about economic, we talked about the political, and now the social impact. That in terms of the social impact, a strong anti-war sentiment gripped Europe, and which argued that the aim of Europe must be to promote peace at all costs. Moreover, the public sentiment was against the involvement of troops in any military intervention on any grounds. The pursuit of establishing a United States of Europe in the words, or the pursuits of establishing a United States of Europe in the words of Winston Churchill, eventually resulted in the formation of European Union. Later. So you see, all these are the aims, or all these were the impacts. And European Union. All these were the economic, social, and the political impacts. And one of the last things also that I'm not writing here, but I've already told you many a number of times, that it weakened the military capabilities and the economic capabilities of these states, and thus which actually weakened their hold over their colonies in Asia and Africa, thus even giving a flip to decolonization in Asia and Africa. That is also something that you can write down, that it gave the weakening of the military might. Okay, you can write down this point also. This is something that you should actually write in the political impact, technically. But you can write down at the end also, that's not an issue, that the World War II weakened the military might of the European powers, and thus World War II weakened the military might of the European powers, and thus gave a momentum to decolonization in Asia, and Africa. Now we're not writing any of the details. We anyways will talk in brief later about decolonization of Asia and Africa. So that's there. Now any doubts still here? No, so in terms of women participation in labor force, etc., we say that the women participation had already picked up after World War I. So there is no such any direct relevance to the women participation. Now, the next thing that we're going to talk about first is let's talk about the interrelated aspects of the Cold War era to begin with. And okay, we'll talk in the next class. We'll talk about communism, and there itself I will also talk about fascism in Italy and Japan also. That's one thing that's remaining, but we'll do it. No issues. But nonetheless, let's firstly discuss what we're going to. And what I'm saying is basically the period from 1945 to 1950. We basically are going to first write a timeline of some of the major events which are happening here. For example, the Berlin blockade, the formation of the Molotov plan, and the Marshall Plan that we've already talked about, the formation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact. So all of that is the reflection. 1945 to 1950 is also the beginning of the Cold War, and we'll write a definition of the Cold War later, and as to how one should define a Cold War. But nonetheless, when we talk about the events, firstly, in 1945, when World War II came to an end, the peace conferences began. And in the peace conferences, the differences over what was to be done with Germany also were clearly visible. So they can also ask you a question that one of the consequences of World War II is also the division of Germany into West Germany and East Germany. And the division of Germany is because of the reasons that we've already talked about. But these differences on what must be the fate of Germany became quite clearly visible in the Yalta and the Potsdam conferences that were happening in 1945 over the discussion of what must be done to prevent the outbreak of another war, what must be done also in the case with the key aggressors. Now, the view of the Western powers was clear that we should not repeat the mistakes of World War I. That even though the Germany was squarely responsible for the outbreak of this conflict and the huge destruction across Europe, the aim must not be to punish Germany. And that is why the military forces of the Western forces, that is Britain, France and US, were occupying Western Germany. And their viewpoint was that Germany must not be forced into any major penalties or war penalties, or must not be imposed any major war penalty, anything must not be imposed. Rather, Germany must be developed as a prosperous, modern, capitalist, industrialized state. And that would prevent any incentive for any war fighting in Europe. So that was the viewpoint of the Western powers. However, Stalin did not share the same optimism and the same viewpoint. Given that half of the total military deaths in World War II were that of the Soviet Union, Stalin's attitude towards Germany was not conciliatory. Rather, it was relatively more revengeful. Also, Stalin saw East Germany as a possible buffer between the Western capitalist powers on the West and the Soviet Union on the East. So, to that extent, while the Western powers wanted West and East Germany to be united under a single democratically elected government which must follow a capitalist model of economic development, Stalin was not in favor of any such Western-led model of economic development or democracy being implanted in Germany. Rather, he was in favor of continuing a military control over East Germany and using it as a buffer between the West and the Soviet Union. Okay, that is why their troops were stationed, and that is why you see that this division of Germany between West Germany and East Germany was something that was a direct output of World War II. Now later, one of the things that you must understand here is that when you talk about Germany or Russia, what we see is that when we talk about Germany and Russia, what we see is that this whole Germany was divided into West Germany and East Germany. Now, but the capital of Germany was within East Germany, and Berlin was within East Germany. At this point of time, it was divided that Berlin also would be divided into West Berlin and East Berlin. And West Berlin would be the capital of the West Germany, and East Berlin would be the capital of East Germany, even though it was within East Germany. And that is why you see that this was also to be divided into West Germany and East Germany. So, I'll come later. So, Western Berlin or West Berlin, I'll come to Bonn and other things later. West Berlin was to be under the British, the French and the US, whereas East Berlin was to be under the Soviet Union. Now, the problem was that this was in East Germany. So, you see that the Western powers needed a land corridor. They needed a land corridor to enter West Berlin, and this was already granted to them. Okay. However, this corridor which had been granted to them was closed by Stalin in 1947. And Stalin closed this corridor for 11 months from 1947 to 1948, and this is what is called as the Berlin blockade. Now, this is what is called as the Berlin blockade. Now, why was the Berlin blockade imposed? This is not the Berlin Wall. Berlin Wall comes in 1961. This is only the blockade. Okay, so they did not construct a wall. It was only a blockade. Now, the Berlin blockade began in 1947 because West Germany was being actively reconstructed from 1945 onwards by the Western powers, whereas East Germany was not being reconstructed, was not seeing any major positive reconstruction. Similar was the fate of West Berlin and East Berlin. Within Berlin itself, there was a huge disparity in the reconstruction efforts in West Berlin as compared to East Berlin. And West Berlin was witnessing rapid reconstruction, because of which a number of people from East Berlin started migrating towards West Berlin. And this was unacceptable to Stalin, because this indirectly questioned the economic policies of Soviet Union. That if Soviet Union's economic development model was good, or it was worthy to be followed, then why were people leaving East Berlin? And so Stalin decided to put an end to this situation. And firstly, he clamped down on the migrations from East Berlin to West Berlin. And he also cut off the land access or the land corridor that allowed West Germany, that allowed the Western countries to push in reconstruction efforts into West Berlin. So this land corridor was actually revoked by Stalin. And this could have easily provoked a war in another situation, but it did not happen, primarily because it's happening in the aftermath of World War II. Nobody wants to provoke a war. So rather than provoking the war, or rather than attacking Soviet Union for disallowing the land access, what the Western countries resorted to was using airlifting of food and essential supplies to West Germany. And they used the air route rather than the land route for the next 11 months. And they continued putting in assistance to West Germany rather than withdrawing assistance from West Germany. And this caused even more embarrassment to Stalin, because this was seen as the Soviet Union arm twisting Germany even further. So this was one of the reasons that Stalin actually preferred withdrawing the blockade eventually later rather than continuing with the blockade, because this was making Stalin more unpopular in Germany. This was in contrast to what was being done by the Western powers. So this is the reason that you see that the Berlin blockade was eventually lifted in 1948. And already the Marshall Plan had also begun. And in contrast to the Marshall Plan, the Molotov Plan had been started by the Soviet Union for the Eastern European countries and for the reconstruction of the Eastern European countries. If the economic angle of the geopolitical conflict was visible in the Marshall and the Molotov plans, the military aspect of the geopolitical conflict was visible in the formation of NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, in 1949, followed by the Warsaw Pact in 1954-55. Now, the NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, was a collective security organization, and it was a transatlantic organization including the United States and the Western European countries, all which had a similar political structure, that is democratic structure, all which had a similar market-led model of economic growth, and that had capitalism. The idea was to be a collective security organization, and this was a collective security organization which was to provide protection to all the member states in case of aggression from an outsider. So just like the League of Nations was a collective security effort, the NATO was also a collective security effort. But NATO was primarily directed at the Soviet Union. NATO was primarily directed at the Soviet Union, because it was the Soviet Union from where only the aggression could come. And given that the ideological differences and the divide over Germany was already visible, so the NATO was primarily an organization directed in an anti-communist manner at the Soviet Union. This was in a reflection of a shift in US foreign policy, because League of Nations, the League of Nations, US does not join the League of Nations. Why? Because it's preferring a policy of isolationism. But US is the leader of the idea of NATO and also the key member of the NATO. So why was US joining NATO? Was a reflection of a shift away from policy of isolationism. And this was in keeping with Harry S. Truman's doctrine, which was the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine said that we need to shift our attitude. We cannot revert, or we cannot return to a policy of isolationism because of the realities in Europe today. That the Soviet Union is a major threat. And the Soviet Union is a major threat because it is the proponent of communist ideas, and this communist threat needs to be contained. This was the policy of containment. The need of one of the major objectives, Harry S. Truman says, of the US foreign policy has to be to contain the spread of communism in Europe. Importantly, please note, I'm saying that contain the spread, not eliminate communism. That is, so the aim of the US foreign policy was not to eliminate communism from Russia or anywhere else, but prevent other countries from falling to communism, whether in Europe, whether anywhere else. Because as soon as new countries, as soon as decolonization was gaining momentum in a number of countries, the question was also, what will these newly decolonizing, newly independent countries do? Would they adopt a state-led model of economic planning or a one-party model like that of the communist regime, or would they adopt a multi-party democracy with a market-led model of economic growth? So the policy of containment was to contain the spread of communism in Europe and to prevent its spread in other areas, especially in the newly decolonizing areas in Asia and Africa. So that is, and to do this, to contain this spread of communism, US cannot continue adopting a simple isolationist approach. Rather, it has to shift away to what is called the Truman Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine was the policy of isolationism. The Truman Doctrine said that they would actively intervene in European affairs and anywhere to prevent the spread of communism. So that's another major shift, and that is one of the reasons why during the Cold War you see an involvement of US troops directly or indirectly, or US involvement directly or indirectly in efforts to contain the spread of communism, whether in the Korean War, whether in the Vietnam War, or whether in the Cuban Missile Crisis. All of them are an example of US interventionism motivated by the Truman Doctrine or the policy of containment. Dekhiye, why am I telling you this? Because they can give you a direct short note. 5 marker on Truman Doctrine, 1 on Marshall Plan. If you know, that's it. Otherwise, there's nothing more to beat around there. Also, what you see, that this Truman Doctrine is happening at the same time where, why was the policy of containment also required? Was because the idea was that okay, so for example, in 1949, we'll see later that in 1949, communism is finding its place or feet in China. And the Chinese Communist Party established a communist state in China in 1949. In 1950, in North Korea also, a communist government established. In 1954, there is also the establishment in North Vietnam of a communist government led by Ho Chi Minh. Okay, something that we'll talk about later. So what you see is that by the end of 1949, in the beginning of 1950s, a number of communist governments were coming in China, in North Korea, or in North Vietnam at that time. And so this is what was called as the domino effect. That if you don't check the spread of communism, then it will soon spread from one region to another. And that is why US intervention was need of the hour. So that is what is the justification US is giving for adopting a more interventionist approach. So they can argue that this kind of a question also they can give you in the mains examination. That the World War II had a profound impact on US foreign policy and its implications were visible during the Cold War. Discuss. Okay. So this kind of a question they can also give you in the mains examination. The shift is from a policy of the Monroe Doctrine or isolationism to the policy of interventionism and the policy of containment as visible in the Truman Doctrine. The implications of this are visible in the Cold War because of US interventions in Vietnam War, in the Korean War, in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Something that we'll discuss in more detail, but I'm telling you the link so that if they ask you the question, you should be able to link them and write them together. Any doubts still here? Firstly.
Sir, why the economic model could influence the geopolitical sphere of both US and US?
Why the economic model?
Like we were capitalism, we were communism. Then why they were fighting war over it?
Why they're fighting war over it? See, one of the things was that, okay, this is one of the contexts. Let's take a more current example. What is asking is that, the Western model are the capitalist model. The Eastern model is the communist model. Then why are they fighting? I mean, both of them can easily continue. rather than engaging in any fight. Now, one of the things is actually that there are 2 or 3 reasons why they are actually ending up into conflicts. Is that firstly, one of the things was that you need to understand that, for example, a number of newly decolonizing countries were coming into existence. Now, these decolonizing countries, if they were to adopt a market-led model, that would provide a market for whom? For the Western countries. See, one of the things is that, for example, after independence, what did we do? We adopted a state-led model of economic planning. We kept our market closed, right? And because that we kept our market closed, we kept an import substitution model, we kept our market closed. India did not become a vast market for US or European goods, right? So one of the things also is of the geopolitics of the Cold War is that if newly independent countries were to adopt communism, then the developing world market would not open up to the Western countries. You see, because the Western countries want a free market approach, right? Whereas the state-led model of economic planning or import substitution would often rely on producing as much as possible within. So economic globalization was something that was to benefit morely the Western, or opening up of markets was something that was to benefit the Western countries more rather than was to benefit the Western countries. And if the states were to adopt a closed market approach, then that was not to be their benefit. That's one of the things. The other thing is also that, for example, you look at a current example, when you look at the whole Arab Spring thing. So what's happening in Tunisia later spills to Egypt, later spills to Libya, later spills to Syria, right? So one partly motivated or provoked the other. So if a few states were to adopt communism, then it was quite much possible that others may also adopt a similar measure. Or there was always the possibility, fear and suspicion, both amongst the West and East, that they could support either pro-communist or anti-communist regimes everywhere. So even if communist parties were coming up in Eastern Europe, the Soviet Union could always provide them funding to carry on their efforts. Or there was always the possibility that in states that had taken to communism, the Western countries could provoke uprisings, could fund uprisings, or anti-communist upsurge could be funded or provoked by the Western powers. So the distrust was one of the major reasons also. One was to capture the newly opening markets, that possibility, and also the mutual distrust, which was visible in the way they handled the Cold War, the way they handled the World War II, and also in the long-standing attitude of the Western powers towards the communist regimes. Okay, so that's all. The mutual distrust between the powers and the question of newly decolonizing countries, all of that provoked, the possibility of a conflict.
But if communist powers cannot match their demand, the market demand, they have to import something.
See, so no. Our assertion is not that the communist powers, so what is asking is that if the communist powers cannot match the demand, they inevitably have to import. So our assertion is not that the communist, देखिए आज हम कह रहे हैं, sitting today we are saying that the state-led model of economic planning is suffering from certain number of problems. But in 1950, it is as good as the Western model, primarily because their economic growth is continuing, and the Soviet Union was financing also. And was financially supporting the communist regimes in other areas also, and was also providing them economic assistance. So it is not that the Soviet Union had lost the race. It is only when they started losing out the race that you see the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Okay, so that's there. Anything else? So let's quickly write down this much, and then I'll surely leave you so that you come for the next class also. Now. The other thing that is going on right now is international relation. That I am presuming is more interesting, right? It's like 4 to 5. So apart from that, what post-independence is also going on. See, one of the things is these topics are small topics. Okay. Just do them now and finish them off, so that आपको बात देखिए प्री और मेंस के टाइम के बीच में ये नहीं सर पोस्ट इंडिपेंडेंस कहाँ से पढ़ना है, बिपिन चंद्रा पढ़ना है, ये पढ़ना है, कुछ नहीं पढ़ना है. It's hardly anything. अगर उससे क्वेश्चन आना है तो एक क्वेश्चन आएगा, वरना वो भी नहीं आएगा. सो यू शुड प्रोबेबली डू इट एंड कीप इट नाउ, सो दैट जब आप रिवाइज कर रहे हैं प्री एंड मेंस के बीच में, यू जस्ट गिव 4 hours 5 hours to it and you're done with it. You are not going to read these things between pre and mains. Pre and mains is the time when you revise core areas, areas that you forget. More importantly, you're optional. You write answers, you improve on your answer writing and you write essays. उस टाइम को वहां यूज करना है. तो दिस इज द टाइम आप ये करके बंद करके रख दीजिए. एक बार अभी पढ़ लीजिएगा, एक बार प्री के इमीडिएटली बाद पढ़िए और एक बार मेंस लिखने जाने के पहले पढ़ लीजिएगा. दैट्स इनफ. So these small topics, don't waste too much time. For example, security. Small topics cannot be neglected also, but also no need to pay too much time on it also. That's there. Okay. So, and also just keep seeing what you can use. देखिए small topics में आपको हमेशा consciously एक effort मारते रहना चाहिए, that you should probably always look at can you use it somewhere else, because otherwise the output, देखिए they're small, but you can't leave them, okay? And at the same point of time, even if you're putting in effort, you should, अब अगर आप 6 घंटे लगा रहे हैं उसको पढ़ने में, तो half an hour look at how can you use this somewhere else, okay? That's apart from a direct question, say in essay or any other area. So let's write down about yeah. So let's write down for the period from 1945 to 1950. Please write down a question first and then the roots of the Cold War era. The roots of the Cold War era can, and one thing let me tell you about IR. IR में ऐसा नहीं है कि 2 साल से 1 या 2 क्वेश्चन आ रहे हैं तो इतने ही आएंगे. They can always be a year where they can put 4 questions also from IR. IR is neither a small topic nor is it a peripheral topic. Like security etc. may still be small, but IR is not a peripheral topic. That's much is there. At the worst case scenario, it gives you 2 questions. In the best case scenario, it can give you 4 or 5 questions also. Okay, और आप देखेंगे तो 2014 में they asked 4 questions back to back from IR. Okay, so ऐसा नहीं है that IR is not important. IR is important, but IR also is something जो आपने एक बार कर लिया, so it's more or less आपको बस normally जो pre और mains के बीच में जो country visits हो रही हैं उसके जो few new developments हैं उसके बारे में पता होना चाहिए, क्योंकि issue नहीं बदलता है. It's not that मोदी जी आए या मनमोहन जी आए तो issue बदल जाता है. So issue does not change, and except for a few developments here and there, there is not much change. So आप जो अभी IR में पढ़ेंगे by and large वही रहेगा useful later. Okay, so that's more than enough for your examination. You have to make synopsis for each subject. देखिए तो श्रद्धा पे है जिसकी जितनी है. Please make synopsis. Please, yeah, in terms of synopsis, make it for those areas, at least for those areas which are high yielding and relatively static. जैसे geography है. Yeah, so for example, whether it is geography, so geography is something जिसको करके अभी से रख लीजिए, बहुत फायदा देगा. Because geography से easily they will give you 70-80 marks in paper 1. ठीक है? In the mains examination, prelims में भी बहुत questions आते हैं. And if you make, for example, आपके जितने maps हैं, जितने वो हैं, उसको concise करके अभी से रख लीजिए. Convert it into 20-30 pages. ठीक है? That you can revise. देखिए अगर आप vegetation पढ़ रहे हैं तो आप vegetation को map पे ही बना लीजिए, उसी के साइड में उस पर लिख लीजिए, rather than कि अभी ये map है, इसके बाद 3 पेज के notes हैं vegetation में. So what you want to do, that conciseness, that varies according to individual. You do it on your own, but do it. It will pay you. जितने भी चीजों का करके रख सकते हैं, it will pay you. Definitely it will pay you. Okay, and please do it at least for paper 1, whether it's social issues, whether paper 1 and paper 1 और paper 4. Paper 4 में मेरा एक suggestion और है आपको, बस positive case studies की एक list बना लीजिएगा. सिर्फ you don't need to write it and complete, but at least you must have some positive examples to write. Negative क्या है वो, उस पे तो आप मतलब हाँ मतलब नेगेटिव पे तो आप कह ढा देंगे, लेकिन राइट व्हाट यू नीड इज also some good case studies, positive examples of development, ethical case studies, etc. So वो देखते रहिए, that will also help. Okay, so do that. And one thing for essays, my suggestion, please, for essays, for all themes, you prepare themes. देखिए, themes prepare करिए ऐसे में, जिस theme के बारे में आपने नहीं पता है, उस theme की योजना पढ़ लीजिए. Whichever theme that you are not comfortable with, or you don't know much about, read the yojana from that, take the relevant material. पूरी योजना को पढ़ के underline करके रखना is no utility. Take the relevant material. If from the whole yojana you may find 1 or 2 articles worth reading or preserving, cut them out, put it in your essay file, make themes within essay and keep piling on that theme. The aim is again to put in एक पेज आपके पास डेटा का होना चाहिए, डेटा का, some good and negative data on every theme, say women, or say on corruption, or say on human development, education. Education एक बड़ी common theme है, health एक common theme है, corruption एक common theme है, women empowerment, women एक common theme है. तो इस पे या land reform, so इस पे जो आपके urbanization is also one thing, climate change और environment is also one thing. तो इन सब पे आपके पास कुछ positive examples, कुछ negative examples, some data and some background होना चाहिए. ये themes prepare कर लीजिए, that will help you very much later. क्योंकि जब आप ऐसे लिखना चालू करते हैं प्रीलिम्स एंड मेंस के बीच में, आप बोलते हैं सर अब ऐसे के लिए कैसे प्रिपेयर करना है, ऐसे के लिए कुछ अलग से नहीं प्रिपेयर करना है. यू नीड टू जस्ट रीऑर्गेनाइज द इंफॉर्मेशन दैट यू ऑलरेडी कम अक्रॉस एंड पुट दैट टुगेदर. You can keep writing essays later after prelims and mains, but background information gathering आप ऐसे कर सकते हैं. Now, the roots of the Cold War era can be traced. The roots of the Cold War era can be traced to the differences between the European powers post World War I and the events of World War II. Discuss. World War II had a profound impact upon World War II had a profound impact upon US foreign policy whose implications were visible during the Cold War era. Discuss. So here we are talking about a shift. Just telling you the framework for the answer. The shift from the Monroe Doctrine or the policy of isolationism towards the Truman Doctrine. This was motivated by the policy of containment. This was motivated by the policy of containment and this was visible in the Korean War, in the Vietnam War, and also in the Korean War, in the Vietnam War, and also in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Okay, so that's there. Now let's finally write about the events, and after that I'll leave you.
Sir, Marshall Plan will also be.
Marshall Plan is also. देखिए, in terms of foreign policy की अगर बात करते हैं तो foreign policy में हम doctrines की बात करते हैं. The Marshall Plan was presented primarily as an economic assistance. It was primarily an economic aid program. They did not say that it is a foreign policy tool. Okay. For example, if you look at the Japanese economic assistance to it, it's also motivated by a part of their foreign policy, right? But they do not say the economic assistance for the bullet train, etc., is a part of their foreign policy tool. So in terms of foreign policy, we predominantly talk about these things. Okay. Now, the next thing that we have to write is the events or the timeline for the 1945 to 1950 period. And here, so here, firstly, 1945, the Yalta and the Potsdam conferences. The Yalta and Potsdam conferences debated the question of the treatment to be meted, the treatment to be meted out, or meting out the treatment basically means that the treatment to be meted out meaning basically the treatment to be given. Okay, the treatment to be meted out to post-war Germany and the reconstruction of Europe. The reconstruction of Europe. So, there were two viewpoints. The Western Bloc, led by US, was keen to develop the unified Germany under a democratically elected form of government. Western Bloc led by US was keen to develop the unified Germany under a democratically elected form of government. Which pursued an open market and pursued an open market or free market and capitalist model of economic development. The Western Bloc was keen to avoid a repeat of mistakes of World War I, in which Germany was treated in a revengeful manner that facilitated the rise of fascist powers. Okay. Now, not written? Everybody written? So, however, Stalin did not share the viewpoint, yeah. So the Stalin did not share the viewpoint of the Western Bloc and argued that East Germany would be developed as a buffer state between the Soviet Union and the Western European countries. This buffer state would prevent any possible spread of capitalism to Eastern Europe. And B, moreover, Stalin had a revengeful attitude towards Germany, which had imposed serious economic setbacks, which had imposed a serious economic destruction on Soviet Union. Moreover, the Soviet Union also suffered I didn't understand. Okay. Moreover, Stalin had a revengeful attitude towards Germany, which had imposed serious economic destruction, upon Soviet Union. Okay. Moreover, Soviet Union also suffered a major loss of military strength in World War II. So all of this had provoked the Soviet Union not to adopt any attitudes of reconciliation towards Germany. This resulted in the maintenance of Western troops in West Germany and the Soviet Union troops in East Germany. Even the capital, Berlin, was divided into 2. Now, even the capital Berlin was divided into 2. Now, 1945 to 1947, economic reconstruction in Western Germany, economic reconstruction in Western Germany picked up pace, while East Germany was being maintained merely as a colony of the Soviet Union. The disparity between West and East Germany widened, and this was visible in the Berlin city as well. And this was visible in the Berlin city as well, where large-scale migration from East Berlin began towards West Berlin. Large-scale migration from East Berlin began towards West Berlin. Stalin enforced, or you can write in 1948, Stalin enforced the Berlin blockade disallowing the land or disallowing the land route access to the Western powers running through East Germany to West Berlin. For 11 months, Akshay Kumar was there. Right? Airlift. The Indians do a pathetic job of making movies on real accounts. India's biggest rescue mission ever was in the 1990-1991, the Gulf War. Okay, where more like 3 lakh Indians had been, brought back from the Gulf, primarily because of the Iran-Iraq war, which had broken out. And this was considered by far the most successful and the most best rescue missions carried out by the Indian government ever till then, or even today. In terms of numbers, that's true that we've never moved as many number of people as we moved then. So that movie Airlift was based on this account. But again, that's what we do. Even for things where there's ample evidence or ample history available, you twist it so that it looks more. So I haven't seen the movie, but I read the reviews of the movie, where it was clearly pointed out that it is portrayed that the government officials, as always, did nothing. and it was one fine individual and etc., which is absolutely untrue. In fact, the Foreign Service played a very critical role in ensuring the safe, rescue of a large number of people from there. So that's there, and one of the एक कुछ ही जगह पे भारत सरकार काम करती है और दिल खोल के काम करती है. Okay, that if you are in search of help, especially in West Asia, the embassies are a very they're very proactive, and they are relatively approachable also. So that's there, and that was there even then. But nonetheless, you see, let's come back here. Now for 11 months, while the blockade was in force, the Western European countries airlifted essential supplies to West Berlin. This made Stalin's control over Berlin and East Germany more unpopular. Ultimately, this made Stalin control over Berlin and East Germany more unpopular, ultimately resulting in Stalin's call of the Berlin blockade. Now, 1949 is where you see that, and here we can write out about the shift from the Monroe Doctrine. We've already written about the Monroe Doctrine, so I'm not writing about it. In the last class itself, we had written about the Monroe Doctrine, or the policy of isolationism. From that, you see that the US foreign policy shifted to the Truman Doctrine, or Harry S. Truman was the US president at this time, and this was the Truman Doctrine. The Truman Doctrine argued that US could no longer afford to continue with an isolationist approach and rather would adopt a policy of active interventionism to contain the spread of communism across Western Europe, Asia, and Africa. So this was what was the Truman Doctrine about, and a reflection a reflection of the Truman Doctrine was the formation of NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, as a transatlantic organization, was the formation of NATO as a transatlantic organization to the formation of NATO as a transatlantic organization or a collective security organization to protect member states from any future aggression from outside powers. NATO was indirectly aimed at preventing the spread of communism across Europe. In response, the Soviet Union headed efforts to form the Warsaw Pact, in 1955, to unite all communist states across Eastern Europe and prevent any external interference in these communist states. So when we talk about the Cold War era, on the one side, the geopolitics